Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mr. Bruce. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. When I was young, on a remote farm in South Africa, Jane's old farmhouse loomed like a relic from another era, with its creaky floors and fading charm. My 5 friends and I had ventured there for a weekend getaway, seeking both adventure and relaxation. But what awaited us was an experience that would forever alter our understanding of the paranormal. Our first night began with the usual revelry. Laughter, drinking, and storytelling filled the air, and as the alcohol took its toll, I decided to retreat to bed early. The farmhouse was old and creaky, and as I lay in the guest room, I could hear the distant sounds of my friends' merriment slowly fading away. Around midnight, a series of unmistakable footsteps echoed through the hallway outside my room. The wooden floorboards groaned under each step, as if someone was walking deliberately toward my door. I blinked awake and, feeling a bit annoyed, called out, "Hello?" There was no response, but the footsteps continued their slow, measured pace before turning and fading away down the hall. I assumed it was one of my friends checking in on me and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Jane casually revealed that her family's farmhouse had a reputation for being haunted. Her tone was almost too nonchalant as she shared the unsettling details. She told us that some nights, while in the kitchen, she'd get the eerie feeling of being watched. At the corner of her vision, she'd glimpse something that vanished when she turned to look. Jane also described the unnerving noises that occurred around 3 a.m. The old pipes would groan and clatter as if someone had opened them suddenly, allowing air to rush through. This was followed by the sound of footsteps walking past her bedroom. Jane had become so accustomed to this that she no longer paid much attention, often sleeping with earplugs to block out the disturbances. As she spoke, a chill ran down my spine. I hesitated, but then recounted the previous night's experience, the footsteps, and my call into the dark. Jane's face grew pale as she confirmed that no one had checked on me. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by Jane's further revelation. The footsteps, she said, always stopped at a table in the hallway where an old rotary phone sat. Jane had grown so accustomed to the eerie calls that she didn't even bother with them anymore. We were all unnerved, so that night, in a bid to find comfort in numbers, we decided to all sleep in Jane's room. We settled in, watching a movie to drown out the house's eerie silence. As the night wore on, one by one, we drifted off to sleep, the only sound being the movie playing on the TV. I woke abruptly to find the screen displaying a dull screensaver, leaving the room in near darkness. An unsettling feeling washed over me, and I glanced at the window, which offered a view into the living room. The blinds were open, and I had a sudden sense that someone, or something, was watching from outside. With trembling hands, I closed the blinds, trying to shake off the creeping dread. As I lay in bed, my mind racing, I heard a loud banging noise from the roof, metallic and violent, like the pipes had been opened forcefully. My heart pounded as I quietly woke my girlfriend, trying to keep my voice calm. As she became aware of the noise, her fear escalated, and she let out a frightened yell. The rest of the group stirred, and we all listened in stunned silence. The noises from the pipes were unmistakable and terrifying, but we tried to calm down and go back to sleep. As we settled back into our makeshift beds, the footsteps began. We heard them clearly. Slow, deliberate steps walking down the hallway, past the door of Jane's room. The sound was methodical and unnervingly close. The footsteps stopped at the table, the familiar click of the rotary phone being picked up and the numbers being dialed. It was the same eerie process Jane had described. We all lay in the dark, drenched in sweat, too scared to move. The footsteps eventually retreated, the phone placed back on its cradle, and the house fell into a tense silence. Despite the terror that gripped us, we managed to drift off again, getting a few hours of restless sleep before dawn. The following morning, we packed our bags and left Jane's farmhouse, each of us carrying the weight of the previous night's fear. About 2 months later, Jane called with news that sent a shiver down my spine. Her grandfather, who lived in the house across from Jane's with his late wife, had passed away. Jane's grandmother had died a year earlier, and it was believed that her spirit had been searching for her husband. According to Jane, after her grandfather's passing, the haunting ceased abruptly. The sounds, the footsteps, the eerie phone calls, all of it stopped. The family believed that her grandmother's spirit had been restless, wandering the farmhouse in search of her lost love, and that her passing had finally brought her the peace she had sought. Our experience at Jane's farmhouse remains one of the most chilling and unforgettable episodes of my life. The combination of eerie noises, the feeling of being watched, and the inexplicable events we witnessed that night left an indelible mark on us all. Jane's story of her grandmother's spirit searching for her husband provided a hauntingly poignant explanation for the disturbances, a reminder that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more than just shadows. They are echoes of lost souls seeking closure. This story takes place a few weeks ago. I went on a cruise for the very first time with my family. I didn't really care for the idea. The ocean and its vastness have always creeped me out, and being out there in the dark night with nothing but miles of water in all directions just was not very appealing to me. But my family dragged me along anyway. Most of the cruise was traveled over the North Atlantic, and it was indeed beautiful. But for me, still unsettling. For the first few days, everything was great. We enjoyed delicious meals, played in the pool, saw a show or two. It really was kind of magical, and I began to get settled in and more comfortable as time went on. But on the fourth night, as we all said our goodnights and got ready for bed, I had an eerie feeling that I just could not shake. I tucked in my 2 daughters and went to bed myself at around 11 at night. The rest of the ship was silent. In fact, I sort of assumed I was the only one still awake, or at least one of the few. I laid down in my bed and tried to get some sleep, not bothering to turn on the TV as I did not want to wake my boyfriend, who was already asleep. I must have managed to doze off, because I awoke with a start not long after to one of those dreams where you feel like you're falling. Groggy as I wasn't very aware of my surroundings, which is why the voices didn't strike as red flags to me. I assumed that the screaming and crying I was hearing was coming from the TV, and that my boyfriend had turned it on. It was quite loud, and I was afraid that it would wake or frighten my daughters, so I sleepily said, "Hey babe, can you turn that down, please?" No answer, and the sounds continued, seeming only to get louder. I groaned in frustration and turned over. "You're gonna wake the girls, turn it." I froze. The TV was off, and my boyfriend was asleep. The sound stopped abruptly as I turned over, and I lay there straining my ears for some time. Nothing. Just silence in the dark room. At this point, I rationalized that I must have dreamt the whole thing. It didn't take me long to fall back asleep after that, mostly because I had not exactly been wide awake to begin with. So the night wore on. I slept well for a while, but when I next woke up, I saw that the clock on my nightstand read as 2:18 a.m. I remember that specific detail vividly for some reason. I lay there for a couple minutes before I think I hear the bedroom door open. I didn't turn to look, as I assumed it was one of my daughters coming to cuddle. I'd taught them that they were always welcome to come get in bed with me if they got scared or felt unwell, and they need not wake me first. I felt a weight press down on the bed beside me and scoot closer. "Hi, sweetie." I whispered a greeting. No answer, but I could hear soft rustling of blankets behind me. Suddenly, against my back, I felt an absolutely icy cold hand touch me. It was so cold it shocked me into gasping. "Oh my goodness, you're freezing. What have you been doing?" I whispered, glancing over my shoulder, although all I could see was a slowly breathing lump under the covers. It didn't register at the time, but thinking back on it now, the figure in bed with me was too big to be either of my toddlers. I still received no answer, but as the icy cold figure pressed close to my back, even laying an arm over me, I grabbed the thick comforter that I'd tossed aside on the bed and draped it back over both the figure and myself. "There you go to sleep, Mama's tired," I muttered, sleepy. The only response I got was a deep, satisfied sigh, and then silence. I fell asleep soon after. The next morning I was once again alone in my bed. Nothing but a slight impression in the mattress and wrinkled sheets remained beside me. I got up and met my family in the little kitchenette of our room where they were making breakfast. My daughters ran to greet me and I crouched down to hug them. "Why'd one of you girls come sleep with me last night?" I asked. The two children continued giggling and casually replied, "I didn't, Mommy," in unison. This surprised me and I glanced to my boyfriend. "Then it must have been you trying to sneak some cuddles, huh?" I asked with a smirk. Sipping his coffee, he shook his head. "No, babe, it wasn't me." At that, my smile faltered. My boyfriend asked me what was wrong, and I told him and the rest of my family what I'd experienced that night. Nobody owned up to having even left their rooms during the night. Creeped out, I went to stand on the balcony of our room, glancing out over the ocean. As I watched the water, something suddenly dawned on me hard. I remembered where we were, and I quickly found our location using Google on my phone, roughly calculating in mind approximately where we would have been at 2:20 this morning. I told my boyfriend what I discovered, and he looked. This happened to me the summer before my freshman year, just barely 14, in a tiny town in Oregon. When I say tiny, I mean it. This town had maybe 1,000 residents and scarcely a gas station. It was mid to late August, maybe a couple of weeks before the new school year, and like most boys my age, I was obsessed with my bike. I think Jim Hopper from Stranger Things describes it best. A bike like this is like a Cadillac to a kid. It was an old red thing I'd gotten for my 13th birthday, with a basket on the handlebars, a metal bit over the back wheel that could seat a second person if they sat right with their feet forward, and an old-fashioned, clunky seat. The kind that sort of feels like it's biting your balls if you sit too close to one end. I loved that bike. I checked its tire pressure after every ride, and added more air anytime it showed any sign of being low, and rinsed it with a washcloth in my driveway every weekend. I was constantly looking for excuses to take it out for a ride, and consequentially had become my family's errand boy. I'm the youngest of 4, but when this occurred, the older 2 of my siblings had already moved out, and my parents split up not long before I started middle school, so it was only my mother, my older sister, and me living there. This particular day, I'd gotten lucky. After I got home from the arcade, I was to take a bag of cans to the can return for some cash, and then my sister had asked me to snag her a snack at the gas station. After I'd finished my tasks, I was planning to collect blackberries. Anyone from the Pacific Northwest will tell you that they bloom rampantly in the summer, often on the roadsides, and are up for grabs to anybody who wants them. Then ride my bike to the elementary school, as the gate was typically kept unlocked to the public, open to the playground there, and I was looking forward to eating a baggie of gummy worms, maybe some blackberries too, and sit on a swing with a library book. Perhaps it was the red glow of the clocks inside the classrooms, the only thing visible through the windows of the pitch-black school, or the sun setting, sending the sky into a quickly darkening navy, hardly a morsel of orange or pink toward the horizon, which was especially odd during fire season. But I hadn't made it through more than a chapter of my book before a feeling of foreboding settled in my stomach. I remember repeatedly thinking to myself, "You came here to read, so you'll read. Just one more chapter." And then, when another chapter felt too long, just another page. It likely didn't help that if I wasn't listening to CDs of whatever new language I was learning at the time, it would have been French when this happened to me, I believe. I was usually listening to eerie, unexplained occurrences when I rode my bike, not too different to this one, and at the time I remember insisting that the story I was listening to was merely making me paranoid. I was told to trust my gut growing up, and if I felt that something was wrong, I should listen to that. I packed my things into my bike's basket very fast. It was 8:53 p.m. when I left. I remember glancing over my shoulder rather frantically at the feeling of being watched, and the classroom's clocks catching my eye. I sped out of that park like a bat out of hell. I felt stranger immediately leaving the school. Everything felt slow, as though something had knocked time out of place by an inch. Every car that passed me and my bike seemed to slow down as they drove past me. Now, I won't go too into detail because it's not important, but I'd been a regular outpatient at the hospital, and I had an appointment 4 days after this for an EKG, some imaging, and I was to be discussing a new medication. So when my heart rate picked up dramatically and I began feeling wheezy, I thought of my mother reminding me to monitor my heart and breathing, and perhaps due to a confusion and fear-scrambled mind, didn't connect this to the other odd happenings, though I now know that these were some of the first warning signs. Because I rode my bike so often, I developed a map of paths to take in my mind, and often took the same route home every day, one that followed the street lamps so that I could see more than the small, weak light on the front of my bike allowed. However, as I rode through the park, lights began to flicker, some buzzing out entirely. The Shell sign on the gas station, which I had a view of out my bedroom window and had never seen off, appeared to be shut down, so I risked it. I wasn't going home very late. I'd made sure I wasn't after the first incident. The latest I'd be home was around 6 o'clock, when I had after-school activities. The first few weeks were perfectly fine, save for some anxiety, but during late September one afternoon I felt it again. That slow, strange, dreading feeling, as though I were moving through honey. Everyone I biked past seemed to stop and watch me go, and when I went down that hill, I ignored the presence I felt watching me in the nearby trees and kept riding. I'll be a junior with the start of next school year, and I'd say I'm much more mature now, definitely taller, and I've even had to start shaving my face. But I can tell you right now, if I ever see that thing again, I'll never be so confident in turning tail on my bike and leaving immediately. 2 people were found mauled and dead on my birthday, and I can't help but wonder if that could have been me. I never stay out past sundown anymore. I live in England in the rural West Midlands, someplace between Tamworth and Burton, but I won't get into too many details since I'm not a fan of doxing myself. I will say, though, that Tamworth is closer to where I am, but Burton is where I go for work, and it's about an hour-and-a-half drive there from where I live. However, the lengths of the journeys back home really vary since I really enjoy the longer drives down rural back roads through the countryside, especially in the winter as nighttime drives are my favorite. It's just something about the curling of the road only visible a few feet ahead of the car, as if the map is just rendering in as you move along it. I've taken a different route home nearly every journey back out of Burton, but I've been working there for nearing on 7 years now, so I have pretty much all of them committed to memory, regardless of season. And I've only ever gotten lost out there twice, once being the first time I ever tried to take a detour home, and the second time in January of 2015 on my way back from an evening shift. I wasn't the last to pack up that night, but the rush hour traffic out of Burton made it so I actually left the town around 7:30 p.m., still with an hour and a half before I even got remotely close to home. I remember driving away and watching in my peripheral as the lights reflected in my rearview mirror gradually became more distant, dying down and fizzling out as I turned into a new-build estate that I often cut through to get onto a B road that led through the countryside back towards my hometown. The housing estate was very pristine and new, built a year prior to this event, I think, and I once got lost in there trying to cut through since every junction, semi-detached red brick nightmare, and cul-de-sac looked so similar. The light in each window was a pale yellow, beaming down onto the pavement below, though never reaching the road. It made me feel safe and hidden there in the dark, despite my headlights on low beam. The only other lights in the neighborhood were the small modernist patio lamps out front of the houses, but as soon as I turned onto the B road home, the winter evening swallowed the light behind me, leaving me floating through that darkness only really found deep into the rural countryside. I drive a 1989 Toyota Camry, so on nights like those I tended to listen to my old cassette tapes. I collect them, and have dabbled in making 1 or 2 janky mixtapes. I remember what I listened to that night. It was the album Squeeze by the Velvet Underground. With the stereo on, I continued my drive as usual, flicking my full beam headlights on and off as the rare other driver came round the camber on the other side of the road. In between these sparse encounters, it was only me and the road unfolding in front of me, listening to the hazy sound of 60s rock. This was my first drive back home from work after coming back after Christmas, so the route must not have been as fresh in my mind as I thought it would be. And I only realized that I missed my turning as I drove into a town that I didn't recognize. I would describe it best as a sleepy, though sleeping as though it were having an uncomfortable nightmare. As my tires crunched on the road, they made an almost hollow rumbling, as if the whole place were built on a concave housing, something curled up underneath it. The town was entirely overrun by fog, thick, impermeable fog that flowed and meandered like water over the pavements and through the cracks under doors. It was a little run down, but looked like it had once been quite quaint. I pulled up on the side of the road, switching on my phone to check Google Maps for a route out of here, only to find that I had no signal. I decided it was no matter, though, as I'm pretty adept at navigation, and it wouldn't be difficult to just turn around and retrace my steps until I came back across the turning I missed. So I did. I reversed and drove back down what I thought was the road I had just driven along, back onto the B road and finding the turning and making it. I tried very hard not to focus on how little I recognized this road and just continue driving. A few minutes later, I arrived back in the town I had just left from. This obviously confused me. I hadn't been too clued in on which road I was driving down, but I was damn sure that I hadn't just driven in a circle. I crawled my way through the town looking for any road signs, until I came across a small Tudor pub called the King Henry. I decided to park up and go inside, set on getting directions out of here and back towards my hometown. By this time, I think it was nearing on 9 p.m. I entered the tiny pub and made my way towards the bar. There was a kid manning it. They looked around 16, with a mess of bright ginger hair, painted black fingernails, and a black t-shirt with some manga cover on it, I think. I don't know. I'm not really into all that kind of stuff. I asked if I could talk to their boss, to which they craned their head over their shoulder and yelled, "Mom!" into the back room. They gave a thumbs up before a shorter woman, also with bright ginger hair, made her way over to me. She asked what she could help me with, and I told her I needed directions back towards Tamworth. I figured she was more likely to know how to get there rather than directly back to my home. I figured I'd get to Tamworth and just take the main roads home. The woman told me I was in a town called Elmsbury Gallows, and that my best bet at getting out towards Tamworth would be to go southward on Main Street onto Elmsbury Way, then head towards Deerfolk Way before veering off right onto Eastford Road. This, I was told, would lead me out of town. I'd then continue forwards until I hit a roundabout and take the third exit towards Tamworth. I asked her for a pen and sticky note so I could jot down the directions and stick them to my steering wheel so I wouldn't forget. When she vanished off into the back room, a tall man came up and sat next to me at the bar. He greeted me warmly, as if we knew each other, then gave me a wide grin, though his glasses had magnified his black eyes so largely that I couldn't make out any smile creases next to them in order to tell if he was being genuine or not. He shook my hand when I introduced myself, telling me his name was Reverend James Fairfax, but you can call me Jim. Everyone does. When he asked why I was in Elmsbury, clearly sensing an outsider, I hesitated, a nagging feeling at the back of my head warning me not to tell him I'd gotten lost. I ended up telling him I was just passing through, though my lie was quickly revealed when the owner returned from the back room with my sticky note with directions on it. She said hi to Jim, who gave me a look of something close to triumph, like he knew all along that I had lied to him. I quickly got up and headed out, back to my car. When I reached it, there was a man leaning against it, chain-smoking. He was short, dark-haired, and flinched when I gently tapped his shoulder and asked him to get off my car. He was clearly very drunk, as he had been leaning all of his weight onto one hand, propping him up on my bonnet, which had left a handprint seared into the frost. I watched him stumble away to lean against a brown VW Beetle as I got back into my own vehicle, sticking my directions to the steering wheel and muttering them to myself before setting off. I started my car and drove off towards Elmsbury Way. The fog was so unbearably thick that I had to lean forward in the driver's seat and squint at the road to see better. It had been about 15 minutes, and I think I got onto Deerfolk Way when my car stalled, stopping with a splutter in the middle of the road, headlights flickering off, and my cassette tape ejecting from the stereo and into the passenger seat. I sat for a moment, listening to the deathly silence of the night, no longer assisted by the street lamps of the town since I'd driven a little way out now. I cursed loudly, and am ashamed to say I threw a little tantrum in my car and cried quite pathetically. It felt it was unfair that this was happening, although there was precious little I could do to change things. I didn't want to open my door and get out and risk letting the heat escape from my car into the cold January night, so I checked my phone to see if I had signal enough to call for help. Very much not to my surprise, it was a dead zone. I cried again. I had stopped on a small gravel road between a sprawling crop field and the outskirts of the forest that surrounded Elmsbury Gallows, neither of which looked all too welcoming, and I seriously didn't like the option of a probable 45-minute walk all the way back into town. There did look to be a small farm up on the hill past the crop field, however none of the windows had any light in them, and since it was now human contact I was looking for, it didn't strike me as being very promising. Honestly, at this point I was more so looking for a bed to sleep in for the night. I think now is a good time to mention that I'm a man of about 6'5" and 300 pounds, so sleeping horizontally in the back seat of my car wasn't looking too appealing to me if I wanted to keep the blood flow in my arms and legs. I was just about to brave the walk back into town when a small trickle of smoke caught my eye, rising above the tree line. A forest fire? Borderline impossible in the UK in January. Campers then, maybe. Also borderline impossible in the UK in January. Someone must live out there. From where I was, the smoke didn't look that far out, and I resolved that my best bet was to walk towards what I had decided was my savior in the forest and ask if they had a spare room. This sounded like a flawless plan to a brain running on a 6 a.m. start, 4 coffees and a pot noodle from lunchtime. As I picked up my things and zipped up my coat against the burningly cold outside, I reassured myself that I was physically imposing enough to scare off anything that wished me harm. We don't really get nighttime predators like wolves or bears in the UK anyway. I think the biggest wild animal I'd ever seen up until that point had been a fox. Regardless, I picked up a big stick as I walked into the forest. Nobody's going to mess with a 300-pound giant wielding a tree branch. I checked the time, 10:43 p.m. Basically, as soon as the road disappeared behind me, the little cabin came into view. It sat squat in a clearing, camouflaged against the forest, save for the tiny orange rims of the windows, which I guessed was the light of the fire inside being absorbed into the tightly drawn blinds. Smoke trailed up from the chimney, and under the awning on the wooden deck I could see an axe sticking out of a chopping block, bits of splinters and kindling littered around it. The place smelled very strongly of pine. I guessed because it was a pine forest, but it was overpoweringly strong here. I breathed a small sigh of relief, happy that the cabin was closer to the road than I thought, and a little impressed with myself for taking this risk and having it pay off. I knocked on the door and tossed aside my big stick, now wanting to appear as non-threatening as I could in order to maximize my chances of being allowed to stay. I was expecting an old lumberjack type to answer the door, or maybe a little old lady, but the woman who made eye contact with me through the gap of the open door looked no older than 35. The chain latch was pulled taut, a line just under her singularly visible wide hazel eye, and she asked me what I wanted in a low voice. I explained to her my situation, trying my best not to come across like some kind of serial killer, and after a moment's hesitation she undid the latch and let me in, saying that she had a spare room her family used sometimes when they came to visit her. Before closing the door behind me, she poked her head out onto the porch, looking from left to right very quickly, as if she were checking for something. The warmth of the cabin pressed in on me, and I awkwardly took off my coat and hung it on a deer ivory hat stand. The cabin was homely, and a lot more modernized than I initially thought it would be. There was a large, hand-crocheted rug on the floor of the living room, along with matching handmade blankets and pillow covers. The fire glowed a sultry amber in its hearth, and I briefly noted the presence of a hunting rifle mounted on the wall above the mantelpiece, looming over the framed family photos and bric-a-brac. My host was a short, though most people are short to me, pale woman wearing a cable-knit blue sweater and baggy gray joggers tucked into Ugg boots. She had short-cropped curly blonde hair and a sour expression. When we made eye contact again, she slid her chipped, bitten fingernails back up into her sleeves. I thought she looked a little nervous of me, so I introduced myself and tried to think of a way of saying, "I'm not a rapist, I promise," without sounding like I was in fact a rapist. I'm not, and I wasn't, just to clarify. She told me her name was Imogen, and followed that up by offering me some hot chocolate. I sheepishly asked if she had any food I could eat as well, only now realizing just how starving I was. She told me to help myself to what she had in her fridge. I opened it, craving a bacon or sausage sandwich, something substantial, but was disappointed to find that there were no meat products whatsoever. At the time, I assumed she was vegetarian. I poured myself a bowl of cornflakes, thanking her through a mouthful of them for the hot chocolate she'd made me. Something about watching a grown man scoff down cereal and cocoa like it was his first meal in months, as he profusely thanked her for letting him stay, seemed to indicate to Imogen that I wasn't so much of a threat after all. We chatted for a bit. I can't really remember what about, but at some point I must have asked her why she lived out here in the forest. Politely, of course. I actually used to like the idea of a little secluded cabin in the woods. Used to. She told me that she loved nature, and that she had a friend who wanted to be a conservationist that she was meant to go to uni to study biology with back in the 90s. They had both worked in the national park, which apparently the town had, though she told me that it had been closed down a number of years ago. I asked why it had closed, and she hesitated, staring off a little past my shoulder for a moment before telling me that her friend went missing one evening in the park. They never found her. There was a moment then, and a ghostly whistle of wintry wind hit the cabin. Wanting to change the subject, but not really knowing how, I pretended to shiver and asked if it ever got scary out here alone in the woods. She raised an eyebrow, eyes flicking back towards the hunting rifle on the wall, which caused me to quickly clarify that I only meant to ask if she had any ghost stories. Look, I was in a strange town in a little log cabin in the woods. Why wouldn't I want to hear a ghost story? Imogen told me then a little up front that so long as the moon silver hunter didn't find us, we'd be safe. Initially, I thought she was joking. Given the context, I assumed she was just referencing a local legend that I wasn't privy to as an outsider. So I chuckled and asked her who the moon silver hunter was. She stared at me, deadpan, then repeated a tale in the cadence of an old children's story. The moon silver hunter, she told me, is an old fairy tale, a local one anyway. My dad used to tell it to me to scare me to sleep. I think they even once told it to us in primary school after a kid went missing in the forest. It's actually a pretty famous case, made national news. You'd recognize it if you saw it. The kid went missing on a cub's hike in the forest. No trace of him was ever found, except 3 milk teeth showing up in a dog's vomit weeks later. I actually had heard about this and told Imogen that. She said she thought I would have, then continued, "Well, the moon silver hunter is pretty well known around here. Ask any 80s or 90s kid, and they'll be able to tell it all by memory." She shook her head, realizing she was getting a little sidetracked. Anyway, the story goes that the moon silver hunter was originally a young man who lived out in these woods with his father in the early 1900s, though some people say it was the late 1800s. Hell, I've even heard someone say once that it was in the English Civil War period, but whatever. She redirected herself. He lived out here with his ailing father, a senile man who he cared for alone out here in a little cabin as they had both been shunned from the town. Together out in the forest, they began to develop a sort of folie à deux, this shared madness that would feed one another's delusions, which all started when the young man's father began talking about a moon-silver wolf whose hide is strong as armor, and whose blood is pure and holy as an angel's. She smiled to herself. I will always remember that part. Anyway, the man's father would talk on and on about this wolf, saying how in his younger years he really wanted to capture it as a trophy, to wear its hide and drink its blood in the hopes of achieving a sort of immortality. As the cabin fever began to eat away at the young man's mind, he started to think about going out and capturing this wolf, rationalizing that he could use its hide to protect himself from attacks from townsfolk, and its blood to heal his father's ailments and slowly deteriorating mind. This madness grew into a righteous conviction, and one winter's night, he packed his rifle and net and ventured out to track and trap the beast. So he wandered out deep into the forest until the early hours of the morning, when a little off into a glade, he saw the shining hide of the moon-silver wolf. Taking his chance, he aimed and shot, hitting the wolf in its side and knocking it to the ground. He ran up to it, elated that he had actually managed to get the thing, and aimed to slit its throat to bottle its blood before carrying it back home to skin. So he cut. and as the blood pooled in the bottom of the little glass bottle, a scent wafted up from the wolf. A scent like red wine, honey, and ambrosia, like a warm baked cake or sweet honey-roasted ham. The blood was said to be angelic after all, and the smell alone was enough to convince the young man that this was fact. Not only could this blood heal his father, but couldn't it also give him immortality? There was certainly enough to go around. Overcome, he put his mouth to the wound he had opened and began to drink. After drinking his fill, he tried to pull away, only to find that his tongue seemed to be stuck to the wound like it was an icy pole. And with each pull, a new part of him stuck, until his head had entirely fused with the wolf's, tearing it from its body and attaching itself to his neck. Now, with the head of the moon-silver wolf, the man was overcome with an animalistic, primal bloodlust, and to this day he stalks the woods at night, hunting rifle on his back, empty bottles strapped to his waist, seeking to track down and drain the blood of anything awake after sundown. I sat for a moment stunned, asking if she still believed the story. I felt a little pang of fear as she emphatically nodded her head yes. He was what took Sydney. He made her missing. She followed that pretty harrowing statement up by telling me that the moon-silver hunter was drawn to the smell of meat and to the sight of light, and that the real reason she was out here was to finally catch him and kill him for taking her friend. I was regretting not taking that 45-minute cold walk back into town, now fairly certain that the King Henry had a sign outside that said it rented some rooms upstairs. Imogen was clearly not too well, and I didn't want to make any wrong moves that could make her lash out at me in fear. I was pretty confident that I could overpower her on my own if worst came to worst, but I probably couldn't overpower a bullet. I made some obvious excuse to go and eat the rest of my cereal in my room, and though I could tell she saw through my bullshit, she let me go anyway. I walked into my room, repeating to myself over and over in my head that this was just for one night. In the morning, I could get her to drive me out into town or call for help on her landline. My little room for the night was cozy, and I remember being impressed that the bed frame and chest of drawers looked to be handmade from pine wood. The prospect that Imogen had maybe handcrafted most, if not all, of the furniture in her house, and possibly even the house itself, overshadowed her concerning neurosis, and I truly felt like a guest in that moment. I had my own little ensuite. I tried turning on the shower, but it didn't work, so I resorted to washing my face in the sink, and using the mouthwash I prayed wasn't that expired from the little cupboard above it. When retrieving it, I tried not to make too long of eye contact with the empty prescription pill bottles filed inside the cabinet. At least Imogen seemed to be taking her meds, or have been taking them. I sank down into bed, checking the time on my phone, 12:03 a.m. I prayed that the night would pass quickly so I could just get home. I think it was around 4 a.m. when I woke up needing water. I was annoyed. I'd been hoping that I could get this all over with fast, so I decided to just grab the water before I could procrastinate doing it and get back to sleep as soon as possible. I stood up and realized that I probably didn't want to accidentally bump into Imogen wearing just my boxers. I really couldn't be bothered to put my work uniform back on just to grab some water, so I threw on the bathrobe that I saw hanging in the bathroom and decided that would simply do. I shuffled into the open kitchen, flicking on and off the lights until I found the switch for the ones that just illuminated the countertops. The sound of the water filling my glass was so loud against the silence of the night that I nearly missed the whistling coming from outside. It was a sharp, commanding whistle, like a hunter calling for his dogs. I froze, trying to convince myself that I was just sleep-deprived, and Imogen's story had got to me subconsciously until I heard it again. And it was closer, and it was calling out to me. I looked up, and against the blackout blinds, the silhouette of a wolf's head peered in. I had to cover my mouth to stifle a yell. My first thought was that it was somehow Imogen trying to scare me, that she had told me that ghost story to rile me up, and was now fucking around outside in a costume to really hammer the prank home. It wasn't funny. I damn near shit myself. The shape on the blackout blinds was still, unmoving, though I could see the shadow of plumes of hot breath slowly drifting up from it, as if the thing were panting. It was leering at me through the blinds, and we both stood in this strange acknowledgement of each other, silently. It lifted a thin hand, putting it to its lips as it shushed me. I know it shushed me because I heard it, a single loud rushing shushing noise piercing through the cabin. I stood there stunned into silence as it turned and walked around the side of the cabin, my eyes following its silhouette against the blackout blinds, once catching its eye through a gap between the blind and the window as it circled round the front of the house. Its eye was round and tiny and humanoid, like taxidermy. I had to wait for a few minutes before I felt like I could move, before I was sure that it had gone. I lay awake until I saw daylight peeking round through the edges of the blinds in my room. Only then my mind felt it was safe enough to sleep. In the morning, Imogen told me she had called into town. Apparently, a local who lived up on Johnson's farm, the farm up on the hill near where I broke down, had called the local police about my car since it appeared to have been abandoned. I got home all right, albeit a little unsettled. Someone actually whistled at me to get my attention as I zoned out at a green light, and it made me jump. I hope Imogen is okay. I still get a little worried about her alone out there in the woods, as she's clearly not well mentally. I'm trying to pretend that fear stems solely from a place of rationality like that. It's been years, but this occurrence still sticks with me. I think I may have even spoken to my therapist at the time about it, since I was scared it could have been a hallucination of some kind. But it was a one-off as far as I'm concerned. I haven't had any visual hallucinations since then. It actually wasn't until recently that I looked to see if I could find a route to Elmsbury Gallows, mainly to check up on Imogen again. Every road map, local library, local encyclopedia, anything I tried to look into to find the town came up with nothing. As far as everyone else is concerned, Elmsbury Gallows does not exist. When I was 15 years old, I lived with my father in a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town, surrounded by dense forests. My father worked as a lumberjack and knew the forest like the back of his hand. We relied on the natural resources of the forest for many of our needs, and among these resources was the valuable ginseng plant. On a quiet autumn day, my father decided to take me with him on a ginseng hunting trip. I was extremely excited, as this was the first time he had allowed me to accompany him on such a mission. We woke up early at sunrise, and after a quick breakfast, we packed our gear and set off towards the forest. The forest that day was full of life. Sunbeams were sneaking between the tree branches, casting dancing shadows on the ground covered with colorful autumn leaves. There was a gentle breeze blowing through the trees, creating a soft and refreshing rustle. Birds were chirping with different sounds, and we would occasionally hear the sound of a squirrel jumping between branches or a deer passing lightly between the trees. We began our journey by walking on a narrow path that deepened into the forest. My father was explaining to me how to recognize the ginseng plant and its preferred growing locations. I listened attentively, trying to absorb all the information he was providing. As time passed, we began to search seriously for the precious plant. As we searched, I felt excited and enthusiastic. I wanted to prove to my father that I could find ginseng on my own. But this enthusiasm made me lose focus on my surroundings. I began to drift away from my father without realizing it, engrossed in searching among shrubs and rocks. As time went on, I found myself in a part of the forest I had never seen before. The trees here were denser, the shadows deeper. Suddenly, I realized I could no longer hear my father's voice. I looked around anxiously, trying to determine the direction I had come from, but everything looked the same. At that moment, I noticed a strange change in the forest. The sounds that had filled the place just moments ago suddenly disappeared. There was no more birdsong, no rustling of leaves, not even the sound of wind. The silence was complete and terrifying. I felt shivers running through my body. There was a strange feeling of being watched. I tried to convince myself it was just an illusion, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. I started to move slowly, trying to maintain my calm and return to the path I had come from. And suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving very quickly between the trees. It was a dark shadow, too fast for me to determine its shape. I quickly turned towards where I had seen the movement, but there was nothing there, just silent trees and shadows. My heart was beating fast, and I began to feel fear creeping into my depths. I tried to call out to my father, but my voice came out weak and trembling. There was no response. I started walking faster, trying to get away from this dark part of the forest. But no matter how much I walked, it seemed I wasn't making any progress. The trees looked similar, and the darkness was increasing around me even though it was still daytime. And suddenly I heard a sound unlike anything I had ever heard in my life. It was a scream, but it wasn't a human or animal scream. It was a demonic scream, a sound that can't be described in words. The sound was so loud that it seemed to come from every direction at once, creating a kind of sonic vortex around me. The scream was so powerful that I could no longer hear anything else. I felt as if the sound was penetrating my body, paralyzing my senses. I couldn't move, I couldn't think. All I could feel was intense terror and the feeling of being trapped in an inescapable nightmare. I don't know how long this situation lasted. Maybe it was minutes, maybe it was hours. All I remember is that everything around me became pitch black, and then I lost consciousness. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a brightly lit white room. There was a faint buzzing sound of medical devices, and I felt a sharp pain in my right arm. I realized I was in the hospital. After a while, my father entered the room. His face was pale and exhausted, and his eyes were red as if he hadn't slept for days. When he saw me awake, he ran towards me and hugged me tightly, as if afraid I might disappear again. After he calmed down a bit, he began to explain what had happened. He said that when he realized I had disappeared, he started searching for me everywhere. He spent hours calling my name and searching every spot in the forest. As night fell, he called search and rescue teams for help. The search continued throughout the night and into the next morning. Finally, my father found me in an area far from where we had been searching for ginseng. I was lying at the bottom of a dry creek bed, about a mile from the trail we had entered the forest on. My arm was broken, and I was unconscious. No one could explain how I ended up in that distant area. There were no footprints indicating that I had walked there, and there was no evidence of what had happened to me. I stayed in the hospital for several days to recover and undergo tests. Doctors and psychologists tried to understand what had happened to me, but they couldn't provide any logical explanation. Some suggested that I might have experienced a panic attack that led to hallucinations, while others suggested that I might have suffered a head injury that led to temporary memory loss. But I know that what happened was real. The fear I felt, the scream I heard, was more real than anything I had ever felt in my life. Even today, years after this incident, I still wake up some nights hearing the echo of that scream in my ears. Since that day, I have never returned to that forest. My father tried to convince me to go back with him on other trips, but I strongly refused. The memories were still vivid and painful. As time passed, I began to hear stories from local residents about similar strange events that had occurred in that forest. Stories of strange sounds, unexplainable phenomena, and people who were lost for short periods and then found in a state of shock. But most people ignored these stories, considering them mere local myths. My mission since then has been to warn people about the dangers of going into the forest alone. I tell my story to anyone who will listen, and I warn them not to ignore the signs of danger. I always tell them, if you find yourself in the forest and suddenly absolute silence prevails, get out of there as fast as you can. Don't wait to find out what might happen. Some believe me, others think I'm crazy, but I don't care. I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt. And I know that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic or science. Sometimes when I look at the forest from my house window, I feel that feeling again. The feeling that something is watching me, waiting. And in those moments, I close the curtains and try to forget. But I know I will never forget. And I hope my story serves as a warning to others. The forest may be beautiful and full of life, but it may also hide secrets and dangers beyond imagination. Be careful, and always pay attention to your surroundings. You may not get a second chance like I did. In the rolling hills of 1950s Czechoslovakia, nestled between dense forests and sprawling farmlands, lay the small village of Březova. It was a place where time seemed to move at its own leisurely pace, where traditions were held dear, and where the whispers of the ancient woods that surrounded the settlement were both revered and feared. Maria Novak, a spirited girl of 15, lived with her parents in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Brzezova. Her father, Yosef, was the village carpenter, known for his skilled hands and intricate woodwork. Her mother, Elena, kept their home and tended to a small vegetable garden that supplied much of their daily fare. Maria was different from many of the other village children. While they were content with the simple life Brzezova offered, she yearned for more. She devoured books whenever she could get her hands on them, dreaming of far-off places and adventures beyond the confines of their small community. This thirst for knowledge and excitement often led her to push boundaries, much to her mother's chagrin. The village itself was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other's business. The central square boasted a small church with a weathered steeple, a general store that doubled as the post office, and a modest schoolhouse where children of all ages gathered to learn. On weekends, the square came alive with a bustling market where farmers from neighboring villages would come to sell their produce and livestock. But it was the forest that truly defined Brzezova. The vast expanse of trees surrounded the village on 3 sides, a sea of green that changed with the seasons. In spring it burst forth with new life, the ground carpeted with wildflowers. Summer saw it lush and vibrant, providing cool shade from the scorching sun. Autumn painted it in a riot of reds, oranges, and golds, and in winter its bare branches stood stark against the snow-laden sky, like sentinels guarding ancient secrets. The villagers had a complex relationship with the forest. It provided them with wood for their homes and fires, game for their tables, and mushrooms and berries for their pantries. But it was also a place of mystery and danger. Parents warned their children not to venture too deep into the woods, spinning tales of creatures that lurked in the shadows and spirits that could lead unwary travelers astray. Maria, however, saw the forest differently. To her, it was a place of wonder and possibility. She loved to explore its winding paths, discovering hidden glades and babbling brooks. The forest spoke to her in a language she couldn't quite understand but felt deep in her bones. It was a siren call that she found increasingly difficult to resist. Little did Maria know that her innocent love for the forest would soon lead her into an encounter that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world and herself. About an hour's walk from Brzezova, through the heart of the forest, or along the winding road that skirted its edges, lay the village of Lipova. While similar in many ways to Brzezova, Lipova had a few amenities that made it a draw for the youth of the surrounding area. Chief among these was the community center, which boasted a table tennis setup that had become the focal point of social gatherings for teenagers from both villages. It was in Lipova that Maria had found a group of kindred spirits. There was Tomas, a lanky boy with a mop of unruly dark hair and a quick wit that often got him into trouble. Eva, with her long blonde braids and infectious laugh, who shared Maria's love of books and often traded novels with her. And then there was Carol, quiet and thoughtful, whose deep brown eyes seemed to hold secrets of their own. Maria had first met them during one of the inter-village festivals that were held twice a year. They had bonded over their shared love of table tennis and their desire for something more than the simple village life their parents seemed content with. Since then, Maria had made it a point to visit Lipova as often as she could, using any excuse to make the journey. Her parents, while initially hesitant about her frequent trips to the neighboring village, had come to accept it as a normal part of teenage life. They set rules, of course. She was to be home before dark, to always let them know when she was going, and to never, under any circumstances, travel through the forest alone. For the most part, Maria adhered to these rules. She understood her parents' concerns, even if she didn't fully share them. The forest, after all, could be dangerous if one wasn't careful. There were tales of people getting lost, of sudden storms that could disorient even the most experienced woodsman, and of course the old legends that spoke of things that defied explanation. But Maria couldn't help but feel a thrill every time she stepped into the cool shade of the trees. The forest path to Lipova was well worn and easy to follow, cutting the journey time nearly in half. The temptation to take this shortcut was always there, especially when she was running late or when the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the exposed road. As spring turned to summer that year, Maria found herself making the trip to Lipova more and more frequently. Her friends there represented a window to a wider world. one filled with possibilities that Brzova couldn't offer. They talked about cities they'd like to visit, books they'd read that opened their minds to new ideas, and dreams of what they might become. It was during one of these visits that Maria's life would take an unexpected turn, setting in motion a chain of events that would haunt her for years to come. The day started like any other. Maria woke early, helped her mother with the morning chores, and then set off for Lipova. She had promised to meet her friends for a table tennis tournament they had organized. The summer sun was high in the sky as she set out, taking the longer road around the forest's edge. The tournament was a lively affair, with teenagers from both villages competing fiercely but good-naturedly. Maria found herself caught up in the excitement, the hours slipping by unnoticed as she played match after match. It was only when she glanced out the window and saw the sun hanging low on the horizon that she realized how late it had gotten. Panic seized her. She had promised her parents she'd be home well before dark, and now she was facing a journey that would certainly see her breaking that promise. Her friends offered to walk her home, but Maria declined. She knew they'd get in trouble with their own parents if they returned to Lipova too late. As she stood at the edge of the village, Maria faced a dilemma. The road around the forest would take at least an hour, ensuring she'd be walking in complete darkness for most of the journey. The forest path, on the other hand, would get her home in half the time. She knew it was against her parents' rules, but surely, she reasoned, it would be safer to get home quickly than to spend more time out in the open. With a deep breath, Maria made her decision. She turned towards the forest path, its entrance a dark tunnel between the trees. As she stepped onto the familiar trail, the sounds of the village faded behind her, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird settling down for the night. At first, the walk was peaceful. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Maria moved quickly, her feet finding the path with ease born of familiarity. She allowed herself to hope that she might make it home before full dark, maybe even before her parents had time to worry. But as the light faded, the forest began to change. Shadows deepened, taking on strange, almost menacing shapes. The friendly chirping of daytime birds gave way to the eerie hoots of owls and the rustling of nocturnal creatures. Maria quickened her pace, her heart beginning to race as the darkness closed in around her. It was then that she noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest, the wind in the trees, the scurrying of small animals had all but disappeared. An unnatural silence fell over the woods, broken only by the sound of her own rapid breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Maria tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. She was nearly halfway home, she told herself. There was no point in turning back now. But with each step, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, and a strange, pungent odor began to permeate the atmosphere. She couldn't quite place the smell. It was earthy, like decaying leaves, but with an underlying sweetness that made her stomach churn. Maria pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the night wasn't particularly cold. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace, afraid that any sudden movement might attract something. It was then that she heard it, a sound so out of place in the silent forest that it stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a low, guttural noise somewhere between a growl and a moan, and it was close. Panic overcame reason. Maria darted off the path, her only thought to find a place to hide. In the darkness, she stumbled over roots and crashed through underbrush, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, finally collapsing against the trunk of a massive oak tree. As she huddled there, trying to quiet her breathing, Maria realized she had made a terrible mistake. In her blind panic, she had lost the path. She was now well and truly lost in a forest that suddenly seemed vast and alien. The tree at her back was her only anchor in a world that had become a swirling mass of shadows and unfamiliar sounds. Tears welled up in her eyes as the full weight of her situation settled upon her. She was alone, lost, and something unknown was out there in the darkness. As she clung to the tree, Maria prayed for morning to come quickly, for surely in the light of day she would be able to find her way home. But the night was far from over, and Maria's ordeal was only beginning. Time seemed to lose all meaning as Maria huddled against the old oak tree. The darkness was absolute, broken only by brief glimpses of the moon, when the wind parted the leaves overhead. Every sound, every rustle in the underbrush, sent a fresh wave of terror through her body. She strained her eyes and ears, desperate to catch any sign of the thing that had chased her off the path, but the forest remained eerily silent. As the hours crawled by, exhaustion began to set in. Maria's legs ached from running, and her back was sore from pressing against the rough bark of the tree. But she dared not move, convinced that any sound she made would bring that creature right to her. In an attempt to calm herself, Maria tried to think rationally about her situation. Surely by now her parents would have realized she was missing. They would organize a search party. All she had to do was wait until morning, and then she could call out for help. The thought brought a small measure of comfort, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization of how worried and angry her parents must be. As she sat there, alternating between fear and guilt, Maria became aware of a gradual change in her surroundings. The pungent odor she had noticed earlier was growing stronger. It seemed to seep from the very ground, a cloying sweetness mixed with the musty smell of decay. The air felt thicker, almost syrupy, making each breath a conscious effort. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Maria realized that the texture of the tree bark against her back was changing. What had been rough and unyielding was becoming softer, almost pliant. In her terror-addled state, she initially dismissed it as a trick of her exhausted mind. But as the sensation persisted, a new fear began to take hold. Hesitantly, Maria reached behind her to touch the tree trunk. Her fingers sank into what felt like damp, spongy flesh. With a strangled cry, she tried to push herself away from the tree, but found that she couldn't move. It was as if the tree had molded itself around her, holding her in a gentle but unyielding embrace. Panic overtook her once more. Maria thrashed and struggled, trying desperately to free herself from the tree's grasp. But the more she fought, the tighter it seemed to hold her. Tendrils of bark, or what looked like bark in the dim moonlight, began to creep around her arms and legs, securing her more firmly to the trunk. As she struggled, Maria became aware of a low, rhythmic sound. It took her several moments to realize that it was coming from within the tree itself, a slow, steady pulse, like a massive, alien heartbeat. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through her body. Time lost all meaning as Maria remained trapped in the tree's embrace. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind unable to fully process what was happening to her. In her more lucid moments, she wondered if this was some sort of dream or hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But the pulsing of the tree and the feeling of bark-like tendrils against her skin felt all too real. As the night wore on, Maria's fear began to give way to a strange sense of calm. The tree's embrace, while still frightening, no longer felt threatening. Instead, there was an almost comforting quality to it, as if the tree was protecting her from the dangers of the forest. In her half-conscious state, Maria found herself syncing her breathing with the slow pulse of the tree. She began to have vivid, dreamlike visions. She saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, pristine and untouched by human hands. She saw ancient rituals performed in hidden groves, heard whispered secrets in a language long forgotten. The visions flowed through her mind like water, leaving behind fragments of knowledge that she couldn't quite grasp. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the leaves, Maria felt the tree's grip on her begin to loosen. Slowly, gently, the bark-like tendrils retreated, allowing her to slip free. She fell to her knees on the forest floor, her legs weak and unsteady. Looking up at the tree that had held her captive through the night, Maria was struck by how ordinary it appeared in the morning light. There was no sign of the pulsing, living entity she had experienced. It was just an old oak tree, its bark rough and unyielding. Disoriented and exhausted, Maria stumbled to her feet. To her surprise, she immediately recognized where she was. The path home was just a few yards away, clearly visible in the growing light. Had it been there all along? Her mind reeled, unable to reconcile her nightmarish experience with the benign forest around her. With shaky steps, Maria made her way onto the path and began the journey home. Her body ached, and her clothes were dirty and torn, but she was alive. As she walked, she tried to make sense of what had happened to her. Was it all a dream, a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? Or had she experienced something truly supernatural, something that defied explanation? These questions swirled in her mind as she approached the outskirts of Brzova. The village was just waking up, smoke rising from chimneys as people began their day. Maria's steps quickened as she neared her home, a mix of relief and apprehension filling her heart. She had no idea how she would explain her absence to her parents, or if they would even believe her if she told them the truth. As she reached her front door, Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. She raised her hand to knock, unaware that the events of the night were far from over, and that her return would bring with it a new set of mysteries and challenges. Maria's knuckles had barely grazed the wooden door when it flew open, revealing her mother's face, etched with a mixture of relief, anger, and confusion. "Maria, where have you been? We've been worried sick," Alina exclaimed, pulling her daughter into a fierce embrace. Before Maria could respond, her father appeared behind her mother, his usually kind face stern with concern. "Young lady, you have a lot of explaining to do," Joseph said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Maria opened her mouth to speak, to begin explaining her terrifying ordeal in the forest, but her mother cut her off. "We've been calling for you for over an hour. How could you ignore us like that?" Confusion washed over Maria. "Calling for me? But I just got home. I was in the forest all night. I couldn't hear you," she stammered. Her parents exchanged worried glances. "Maria," her father said slowly, "you came home last night. You've been in your room for hours. We thought you were angry with us for some reason and refusing to answer when we called you for dinner." Maria felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her feet. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I was in the forest. The tree, it held me all night. I only just got free at dawn." Her parents' expressions shifted from anger to